It was an ordinary morning, bustling with the usual noise of the city. Cars honked as they squeezed through crowded streets, people hurried by, all lost in their own world, each focused on the task at hand. The courthouse loomed ahead in the distance as the prosecutor, feeling the weight of the case they were preparing for, walked briskly down the street. It wasn't an unfamiliar route. They had taken this path countless times before, but today was different. Today something felt off. The prosecutor, a person known for their sharp intellect and relentless dedication to justice, didn't usually take much notice of the world around them. But that morning, their mind was clouded with thoughts about the case they were about to present. It was important, a case that had the potential to set a precedent, a case that could push them closer to the top of their career, and with so much on the line they couldn't afford to let distractions get in the way. The prosecutor's steps were quick and purposeful, the sound of their shoes tapping against the pavement seeming to echo in the cold morning air. It was still early, and the streets weren't too crowded, but there were a few pedestrians making their way to their destinations. A few joggers, a group of students chatting as they walked by, and the occasional taxi pulling over to let out a passenger. As the prosecutor neared the corner of a small side street, they noticed a police officer standing on the sidewalk. The officer, clad in a dark uniform, was leaning against the corner of a building, seemingly waiting for something or someone. The prosecutor's eyes flicked briefly in the officer's direction but quickly turned away. They had no reason to stop or engage. The officer's presence was not unusual. Officers were everywhere, especially in this part of town. But as the prosecutor continued walking, they heard footsteps quicken behind them, followed by the sound of the officer's voice calling out, "Excuse me." The officer's tone was sharp and commanding. The prosecutor hesitated for a moment. It wasn't often they were stopped by officers on the street, but this wasn't a situation they could ignore. They turned around, the voice now making their stomach tighten. Something about the officer's tone was off. It wasn't the typical polite, "Excuse me, sir," or "ma'am." No, this was different. "Yes?" the prosecutor responded, trying to maintain a calm composure. They had dealt with officers in a professional capacity many times before, but this felt different. The officer, with a hint of suspicion in their eyes, looked the prosecutor up and down. The momentary glance didn't sit right with the prosecutor. There was something about the officer's stare, something calculating, even predatory. They couldn't quite put their finger on it. "I need to ask you a few questions," the officer said, his voice low and controlled. "Where are you headed?" The prosecutor didn't think twice before responding. "I'm on my way to the courthouse." The officer took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the prosecutor's face. There was a moment of silence, a strange tension building in the air between them. The prosecutor felt the hairs on the back of their neck rise, a subtle but unmistakable feeling of discomfort starting to creep in. "You look like someone who's trying to make something of themselves," the officer said suddenly, the words sharp and pointed. "I hope you're not mixed up in anything shady." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. The officer's words were uncalled for, but they had heard things like this before. They dealt with comments from people who didn't understand their profession or the value of the work they did. But this felt different. "I'm just trying to do my job," the prosecutor responded, their voice steady despite the unease rising in them. "I'm heading to the courthouse to do exactly that. Now, if you'll excuse me." Before the prosecutor could finish their sentence, the officer stepped even closer, now invading their personal space. The intensity of his gaze never faltered, and there was something in the officer's eyes that suggested he wasn't going to let the prosecutor walk away that easily. "You don't look like someone who belongs in that world," the officer said with an unsettling grin. "A courthouse? What would someone like you be doing there?" The words hung in the air like a weight, the officer's undertones unmistakable. The prosecutor could feel the sting of those words, but they bit their lip and held back the urge to snap back. They knew better than to engage with someone looking for a fight. "Excuse me, officer," the prosecutor said, their voice now firmer, more authoritative. "I have work to do. Please let me pass." But the officer wasn't having it. Without warning, he reached out and shoved the prosecutor hard in the chest. It wasn't a playful shove or a friendly nudge. It was a forceful push meant to intimidate, to test the prosecutor's resolve. The prosecutor stumbled backward, surprised by the sudden aggression. Their foot caught on a loose curbstone and they fell, hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Pain shot through their body as they tried to catch their breath, struggling to understand what had just happened. The officer didn't move. He stood there looking down at the prosecutor as they lay on the ground, winded and disoriented. There was no apology, no concern, just a cold, blank expression on his face. "You should know your place," the officer muttered, turning to walk away without so much as a second glance. The prosecutor lay there for a moment, unable to process what had just occurred. Their chest hurt, and they could feel a sharp pain in their ribs. They tried to push themselves up, but the pain was too much. Something wasn't right. They realized with growing dread that they might have broken something. Their ribs were tender to the touch, and every shallow breath sent a sharp jolt of agony through their body. A few people had witnessed the scene, but no one stepped forward to help. Some of them kept walking, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. A few others stood in shock, unsure of what to do. It was only when a young woman who had been standing nearby approached with a concerned look on her face that the prosecutor realized they weren't completely alone. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, kneeling beside the prosecutor. "I think so," the prosecutor replied through gritted teeth. They were trying to sound calm, but it was hard to ignore the pain in their ribs. The woman offered a hand to help them up, but the prosecutor waved it away, gritting their teeth as they slowly rose to their feet. "I'll be fine," they said, their voice hoarse, "but I need to get to the hospital." The pain in the prosecutor's chest intensified as they carefully walked down the street, each step causing a sharp, stabbing sensation. Their ribs felt like they were grinding together with every breath, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to focus on anything other than the discomfort. But despite the agony, the prosecutor knew they had to keep moving. The courthouse was just a short walk away, but they couldn't think clearly about the case or the meeting that was waiting for them. Instead, their thoughts kept circling back to what had just happened: the unexpected shove, the officer's cruel words, and the disturbing way he had treated them. The young woman who had offered help had walked away, unsure of what more she could do, and now, as the prosecutor moved closer to the hospital, they couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had just unfolded. They weren't sure how to process it. Had this really just happened? Was this something they could brush off and forget? Or was it the beginning of something much more serious? Inside the small emergency room, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the prosecutor sat down in one of the plastic chairs. The nurse at the front desk greeted them with a polite smile, but the prosecutor could barely muster the energy to respond. They barely registered the forms they had to fill out and couldn't remember the last time they had felt so utterly drained. "I think I might have broken some ribs," the prosecutor said quietly to the nurse, their voice sounding weak even to their own ears. The nurse nodded, leading them into one of the exam rooms. It was all so mechanical, as if this sort of thing happened every day, and maybe it did for some people. Perhaps they were used to seeing the aftermath of assaults, the physical toll of aggression. But for the prosecutor, this felt like a violation of everything they stood for. They had dedicated their career to justice, to upholding the law, and to ensuring that people like that officer would be held accountable for their actions. But now here they were in a sterile room, nursing injuries caused by someone who was supposed to be protecting the public. The doctor arrived shortly after, introducing themselves in a calm, professional manner, but the prosecutor's thoughts were still scattered. The doctor explained the process of checking for broken ribs, asking the prosecutor to remove their jacket and shirt so they could examine the area. The prosecutor winced when the doctor pressed gently on their ribs, sending waves of pain through their body. "You're likely dealing with a couple of fractured ribs, but we'll need an X-ray to be sure," the doctor said, offering a sympathetic look. "It's going to hurt for a while, but with rest you should be fine." The prosecutor nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The officer's face kept replaying in their mind, the coldness in his eyes, the harshness of his shove, and the lingering words that had followed. They couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated incident. There was something about the way the officer had acted, the way he had tried to diminish them, to belittle them. It wasn't just a random act of aggression. It felt personal. The prosecutor's phone buzzed in their pocket, breaking their train of thought. It was a message from a colleague, asking if everything was all right and if they were going to make it to the meeting at the courthouse. The prosecutor typed a quick reply, telling them they wouldn't be able to attend and explaining the situation in the briefest terms possible. As they set the phone back down on the table, their hearts sank. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a reminder that their career was built on facing off with people who, at times, would go to great lengths to avoid being held accountable. A few minutes later, they were sent for the X-ray. The hospital staff moved with practiced precision, the whole process taking less time than the prosecutor had expected. When the results came in, the doctor confirmed their worst fears, 2 broken ribs. It wasn't the worst injury they could have sustained, but it was certainly going to slow them down for a while. The doctor offered painkillers, but the prosecutor declined, wanting to remain clear-headed for whatever lay ahead. When they were finally discharged from the hospital, it was already late afternoon. The city had grown quieter, the once bustling streets now less populated as people began to head home. But for the prosecutor, there was no going home just yet. They needed to figure out what to do next. The officer who had caused this injury was still out there, walking the streets, likely thinking nothing of what had just happened. The prosecutor couldn't just let this go. They couldn't let it slide like so many others might. The thought of going to the police with their story crossed their mind, but the prosecutor quickly dismissed it. What would they do? File a report and hope something came of it? The thought of going through the system only to be dismissed or ignored didn't sit well with them. There was too much at stake for that. The more they thought about it, the more certain they became that they had to take a different route, one that could bring real accountability. By the time they reached their apartment, the pain in their chest was unbearable. Every breath felt like a deep stab. They could feel the weight of the day crushing down on them, but their mind wouldn't stop racing. They could see the officer's smug expression as they had lain on the ground. Helpless, the crowd watching in silence. The prosecutor's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the media outlet they followed closely. The story of the encounter had already hit the local news. Apparently, a few bystanders had managed to capture the confrontation on video. The video, though shaky and unclear, still showed enough for the viewers to get a sense of what had transpired. The prosecutor could feel a knot form in their stomach. The video wasn't detailed, but it was enough to prove that something had gone terribly wrong. There were a few comments below the video, some supportive, others questioning the actions of the prosecutor, though there was no indication yet of who the officer was. The prosecutor felt a rush of frustration. People online would never understand the complexity of the situation. They didn't see the full picture. But as the prosecutor scrolled through the comments, one stood out, a message from a familiar name. It was a colleague from the district attorney's office. "We need to talk," the message read. "This is bigger than you think." The prosecutor stared at the phone screen for a moment, trying to decide what to do next. The decision wasn't an easy one, but the truth was clear: they couldn't let this go. Not after everything that had happened. They had to find a way to make sure this officer faced the consequences for what he'd done. And if the system wouldn't do it, they would. The prosecutor set the phone down, their mind made up. It was time to take action. The days following the incident were a blur of physical pain and emotional turmoil. The prosecutor's ribs still throbbed with every movement, every breath a reminder of what had happened. They had tried to go about their daily routine, but it wasn't easy. The physical discomfort made it difficult to concentrate, and the more they thought about the officer and the attack, the more their anger simmered beneath the surface. They had never imagined they would find themselves in this situation, victimized by someone who was supposed to serve and protect. But now that it had happened, they couldn't just walk away from it. They needed to make sure the officer was held accountable, no matter how difficult it might be. The first step was reaching out to the legal team. The prosecutor knew the system inside and out, how to navigate the courts, the legal procedures, and the often complex web of bureaucracy that came with cases like these. But this wasn't just any case. It was personal. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized this could be much bigger than just an isolated incident between one officer and one prosecutor. The prosecutor sat at their desk, phone in hand, as they scrolled through their contacts. They stopped at the name of a colleague, a lawyer who had worked with them on several high-profile cases. It was time to call in someone who understood the intricacies of the law and could help them take the next step. They dialed the number and waited, the phone ringing for what felt like an eternity before someone answered. "Hey, it's me," the prosecutor said, trying to keep their voice steady. "I need your help with something." "Of course, what's going on?" came the response, calm and professional as always. "I'm not sure where to start," the prosecutor replied, their voice faltering slightly, "but something happened. I was assaulted by a police officer and I need to make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the sound of shifting papers in the background. "Assaulted? Are you okay?" "I'm fine physically," the prosecutor answered, though it wasn't the truth. The pain in their ribs reminded them that they were far from fine. "But I need help making sure this officer is held accountable. I can't just let this slide." The lawyer's voice was firm now, a tone the prosecutor recognized as their "let's get to work" voice. "Okay, tell me everything. We'll figure this out." The prosecutor recounted the entire incident, the officer's words, the shove, and the video that had already made its way online. They also explained how they had gone to the hospital and received confirmation of 2 broken ribs. The lawyer listened carefully, asking a few clarifying questions along the way before letting out a deep sigh. "You're right," the lawyer said after a moment. "This is bigger than just a simple assault. It's about abuse of power, racial profiling, and a complete violation of your rights. We need to act fast before this becomes a media circus, but we also need to be strategic." The prosecutor leaned back in their chair, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. They had never been in a position like this before. They had spent their career prosecuting others, not being the one who needed to seek justice. But now the roles were reversed and it was a harsh reality to face. "Okay, so what's the plan?" the prosecutor asked, determined to move forward, even if it meant stepping into uncharted territory. "We need to start by filing an official complaint," the lawyer said, "but we'll also need to prepare for the possibility that the police department will try to downplay this or sweep it under the rug. I'd suggest gathering any and all evidence you can. Witness statements, the video, hospital records, everything." The prosecutor nodded, making mental notes. They already had the witness statement from the young woman who had helped them after the attack, and the video was starting to circulate on social media. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They could work with that. "Are you ready for the fallout?" the lawyer asked, their tone serious now. "This is going to get ugly and the media will pick it apart. You might face backlash and you'll definitely be under a microscope. But if you're willing to fight for this, I'll stand by you." The prosecutor's heart raced at the thought of the public scrutiny they would soon face. They had always been in the background, working behind the scenes to put criminals away, never seeking the spotlight. But now the spotlight was on them and they had no choice but to face it head on. "I'm ready," the prosecutor said, their voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "I can't let this go. This officer has to be held accountable." The lawyer agreed, and they began to put the pieces of the plan together. The first step was to file the complaint with the police department, outlining the incident and providing the evidence they had gathered. The prosecutor knew this would be the most difficult part. They would have to face the very system that had failed them in the first place, but there was no other choice. Over the next few days, the prosecutor and the lawyer worked tirelessly to prepare the case. They went over the evidence again and again, fine-tuning the details and ensuring that everything was in order. The video of the incident had gone viral, and the public's reaction was swift. Some people sided with the officer, claiming the prosecutor had provoked the situation, while others rallied behind the prosecutor, calling for justice. The comments and opinions were polarizing, but one thing was clear. The story wasn't going to disappear anytime soon. The police department's response was slow but inevitable. After several days, they finally issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising to investigate the matter. But the prosecutor didn't trust the system. They knew how these things often played out. Slow investigations, vague statements, and ultimately no real consequences. That's why they had taken matters into their own hands. The next step was to file a formal lawsuit against the officer, and possibly the police department itself, for the assault and the violation of their civil rights. The legal team had already prepared the necessary documents, and the prosecutor was ready to take the stand and testify about what had happened. It was going to be a long, hard battle, but the prosecutor was determined to see it through. As the day of the lawsuit filing approached, the prosecutor couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had always been on the other side of cases like this, representing the victims, but now they were the one in need of representation. It was a humbling experience, and one that made them question the fairness of the very system they had spent their career upholding. But as they sat in their office, Preparing for the next steps, one thing became clear to the prosecutor. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the system, for everyone who had faced injustice and had been told to stay quiet. They couldn't let this officer's actions stand. They had to speak up. For themselves, and for everyone else. The days after filing the lawsuit were a blur. The initial shock had worn off, and now the weight of what the prosecutor was doing felt heavier with each passing moment. There was no turning back now. They were in the middle of a battle they never expected to fight, and with each step the stakes grew higher. The officer, now under internal investigation, had gone silent. The media attention was relentless, with new updates and commentary flooding social media, news websites, and local television. The prosecutor had become a symbol of both resistance and vulnerability, someone standing up to the very system they had worked to uphold. At first, the prosecutor tried to maintain their usual routine. They still had their cases to work on, their professional responsibilities to attend to, but everything felt different now. It was hard to focus on anything else when the eyes of the public were on them. They couldn't escape the constant reminders of the incident, the flashing images of their face caught on camera, their names splashed across news reports. The phone calls began pouring in. Some were supportive, others were critical. The prosecutor's inbox was flooded with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers, each offering their opinion on the matter. Some praised the prosecutor for their bravery, calling them a hero for taking a stand. Others accused them of exaggerating, claiming they were just another public figure looking for attention. The division in the public opinion was evident, and as the prosecutor sifted through the messages, the weight of the situation settled heavily on their shoulders. In the midst of all this, the lawyer had remained a steady presence. They spoke daily, checking in and offering guidance on what needed to be done next. The legal team had begun preparing for the upcoming court proceedings. They would need to gather more evidence, reach out to potential witnesses, and build the case against the officer. But the prosecutor knew that the hardest part was yet to come, the trial. As the days wore on, the prosecutor found themselves grappling with a growing sense of unease. They had spent their career prosecuting others, building cases and presenting evidence. But now the situation was reversed. The tables had turned and they were no longer the one in control of the narrative. Every step forward felt uncertain, as if the very system they had spent years working within was now working against them. One afternoon, the prosecutor was sitting in their office, reviewing case files when their phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, they answered. "Hello?" they said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Is this the prosecutor involved in the incident with the officer?" The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. The prosecutor paused, a chill running down their spine. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Richard Hayes," the voice replied. "I'm with a local news outlet and I'd like to speak with you about the incident. We've been covering the story and we'd like to get your side of things." The prosecutor's heart skipped a beat. They hadn't expected the media to come directly to them. It was one thing to be talked about on the news, but now they were being asked to speak on record. "I don't think I'm ready to give a public statement just yet," the prosecutor said, trying to keep their voice steady. "I'm focusing on the legal side of things right now." There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end responded with a subtle shift in tone, one that carried a hint of persuasion. "I understand, but the public is demanding answers. This is a story that's resonating with a lot of people. You have the opportunity to shape the narrative, to control the conversation. Don't you think it's time to speak up?" The prosecutor felt a tightening in their chest. They hadn't considered the idea of taking control of the public narrative. In truth, they hadn't wanted any of this to be public. But the officer's actions had forced their hand. And now, every move they made would be scrutinized. "I'll think about it," the prosecutor said, hanging up before the reporter could say anything more. Their thoughts were racing. Was it time to speak out, or would doing so only escalate things further? The next few days were filled with interviews, meetings, and phone calls. The prosecutor met with the lawyer several times, strategizing about the best way to move forward. The officer under investigation remained silent, his attorney issuing statements of their own, claiming that the prosecutor had been the aggressor. The media frenzy had only intensified, with news outlets covering every new development. The prosecutor's discomfort with the situation grew with each passing day. But despite the media's pressure, They knew they had to stay focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about personal vengeance or public opinion. It was about accountability. It was about standing up to a system that had failed them and countless others. The trial date was set, and soon enough, the prosecutor found themselves sitting in a courtroom, facing the officer who had assaulted them. The room was tense and the air felt thick with anticipation. The officer, dressed in his police uniform, sat across the room, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, sitting on the other side, couldn't help but notice the coldness in his eyes. The room was filled with lawyers, witnesses, and a handful of reporters, all waiting for the proceedings to begin. The judge, a stern but fair individual, entered the courtroom and took their seat. The moment of truth was upon them. The prosecutor's mind raced as they thought about what had led to this moment. A simple walk down the street, an unprovoked attack, and now a fight for justice. They had never imagined that they would be here in this position, but here they were. The case was no longer just about the officer's actions. It was about the larger issue of police brutality and the abuse of power. The proceedings began with opening statements. The officer's defense attorney painted a picture of the prosecutor as an aggressive individual, one who had provoked the officer's actions. They claimed that the officer had acted in self-defense, that the prosecutor had been the one to escalate the situation. The prosecutor, listening intently, felt their heart pound in their chest. It was clear that the officer's defense would try to twist the facts to suit their narrative. But the prosecutor wasn't going to let that happen. When it was their turn to speak, the prosecutor stood up and faced the court. Their voice was steady, even though their hands shook slightly. They recounted the events of that day, detailing how the officer had approached them, how the conversation had escalated, and how, without warning, they had been shoved to the ground. They talked about the physical pain, the humiliation, and the realization that this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was an example of the abuse of power that too many people had experienced at the hands of law enforcement. As they spoke, they could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just their story anymore. It was a story that resonated with so many people who had experienced similar injustices. The prosecutor was no longer just a victim. They were a voice for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The trial continued, each day bringing new revelations and testimonies. The prosecutor's legal team worked tirelessly to build their case, presenting evidence, witness testimony, and the video footage that had captured the moment of the assault. Slowly but surely they were making their case, but the outcome was still uncertain. The prosecutor knew that even if they won, it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't undo the damage done by the officer's actions. It wouldn't bring back the sense of safety and trust that had been lost. But despite all of this, one thing was clear. They had to keep fighting. For themselves, for the people who had been hurt, for the system that needed to be held accountable. And as the trial continued, they held on to that truth, knowing that the outcome would ultimately shape the future of justice, not just for them, but for everyone who had been affected by the system. The days leading up to the final verdict were the longest the prosecutor had ever experienced. The court was in recess for the weekend, but the atmosphere was still thick with tension. The prosecutor had spent sleepless nights reviewing evidence, watching the trial unfold in their mind and wondering how it would all end. They had come so far, but the outcome was still uncertain, and with each passing day, the pressure only intensified. They spent the weekend alone in their apartment, trying to distract themselves with anything they could. Books, old case files, movies they hadn't had time to watch, but it all felt like a blur. Every time they closed their eyes, they could still see the officer's face, the smug expression, the cold eyes that had looked down at them as they lay on the pavement. It was hard to push those images away, but they knew they had to stay focused. The fight wasn't over. On Monday morning, the courtroom was packed. The media had turned up in full force, eager to get the latest update on the case. The officer, still in his uniform, sat quietly in his seat, his lawyer beside him, both awaiting the judge's instructions. The prosecutor sat on the other side, their legal team gathered around them, all of them tense but determined. The time had come. The final arguments were about to begin. The prosecutor took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that had settled in their stomach. They had already given their testimony, but now it was time to listen, as both sides made their closing statements. The tension in the air was palpable, and the weight of the case pressed down on everyone in the room. The prosecutor's lawyer stood up first, walking to the front of the courtroom to deliver their closing remarks. "We've heard the facts," the lawyer began, their voice calm and steady. "We've seen the evidence, we've heard from witnesses, and we've watched the video footage. There is no question that what happened that day was an act of aggression, unprovoked, unwarranted, and unjust. The officer used his position of power to hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. He violated the prosecutor's rights, and he violated the trust placed in him by the community. We asked the court to hold him accountable for his actions." The prosecutor's heart swelled with a sense of gratitude for their legal team. They had been with them every step of the way, helping them navigate the complexities of the case. Their lawyer's words were simple but powerful, and as they spoke, the prosecutor could feel the weight of the entire courtroom's attention resting on them. When the officer's lawyer rose to make their closing statement, the prosecutor felt their body tense. They had expected the defense to be strong, but the way it played out still left them reeling. The officer's lawyer tried to paint the prosecutor as someone who had been difficult, someone who had instigated the situation. They claimed that the prosecutor had used their position to provoke the officer, that their actions had been the cause of everything that had happened. The officer was simply doing his job, the defense lawyer argued. He was trying to maintain control of the situation. It was the prosecutor's actions that led to this altercation. "We ask that you find the officer not guilty of any wrongdoing." The prosecutor clenched their fists under the table, the frustration building within them. It wasn't just the words, it was the implication that their pain, their suffering, their very dignity could be twisted into something they weren't. It was the attempt to turn the victim into the villain. But they knew that this was part of the process. They had to stand firm not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever faced the same kind of injustice. The judge took the case under advisement and called for a brief recess. As the room emptied, the prosecutor stayed seated, staring at the floor, lost in thought. The next few hours would decide their future. But no matter what happened, they knew one thing for sure. They had done the right thing. They had stood up when it would have been easier to walk away, and they had fought for what was right. That, they believed, was what mattered most. During the recess, the prosecutor's phone buzzed with messages of support. Friends, family, colleagues all reaching out to offer words of encouragement. But despite the outpouring of positivity, the prosecutor couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something much bigger: accountability. It was about ensuring that the officer faced consequences for what he had done, regardless of the outcome. The courtroom reconvened a few hours later. The judge sat at the bench, his expression unreadable as he addressed the room. "We've heard the arguments. We've reviewed the evidence, and it's now time to deliver a verdict." The prosecutor's heart beat in their chest, each second feeling like an eternity. The officer sat across from them, his face tense, waiting for the judge's decision. The media had fallen silent, everyone holding their breath. The judge glanced over at the prosecutor, then at the officer, and finally spoke. "In this case, the court finds the defendant guilty of misconduct and excessive use of force. The actions taken by officer's name were unjustified and violated the rights of the prosecutor. As such, the court hereby sentences the defendant to sentence." The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The prosecutor's body went numb as the reality of the verdict set in. The officer had been held accountable. The justice they had fought for had been delivered. But it wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was the acknowledgement of the pain, the suffering, and the wrong that had been done. The prosecutor had not only fought for themselves, but they had fought for the countless others who had been wronged in the same way. As the gavel came down, a sense of relief washed over the prosecutor. They had won, but it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had faced injustice and been told their pain didn't matter. It was a reminder that accountability could be achieved, even when the system seemed stacked against you. The courtroom slowly emptied, and the prosecutor stood up, feeling a weight lift off their shoulders. They walked out of the courtroom with their head held high, knowing that they had done the right thing. They had taken on the system and come out victorious, and for the first time in weeks they allowed themselves to take a deep breath. The fight was over, but the journey had changed them. They had faced their greatest fear and come out stronger for it. And while the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, they knew they had made a difference. In the end, the prosecutor realized that this battle was more than just about one officer. It was about the larger fight for justice, the fight to ensure that no one else would have to face what they had. It was a fight worth fighting, and one that had changed the course of their life forever.